delightful occasion, and thank you very much indeed for coming. Yes, I'll try and spin this out for 3 minutes or so, but it won't be the case. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome Ben Grant. Now, Ben and I go back many years. In fact, he was a pupil at the school where I was, which just shows how old he is. He's quite an old person. Anyway, Ben read psychology at Exeter University and became involved with Amnesty International at that point. And then he did a master's degree at Leicester University, specialising in human rights. Great. He completed the legal package course and became a trainee solicitor in a law firm where he specialised in immigration and asylum. For 10 years, he was a solicitor specialising in legal aid, and as well as in human rights and prison law. In 2022, his law firm closed. He retrained as a secondary school teacher, and now teaches in a secondary school in Devon, teaching A-level law, which includes a strong component of human rights. Ben is a fantastic person. I say no more about it because his commitment both to immigration, to asylum is unparalleled, and we're delighted, Ben, that you are actually here and going to speak to us. And that almost brings us to our past. But is there anything else anyone would wish to say?
Ben is an active member of Taunton Amnesty International Group.
Yes, which we were involved in when we were in Taunton. A very strong group indeed. So we're delighted, Ben, and we'll look forward very much to hearing what you have to say, Ben.
Thank you very much. Rather than standing off, I still feel like I'm at school.
Oh yes, I did that. Ben was a pupil at Queen's College in Taunton when I was the school chaplain.
So, Ed and Audrey both taught me at school, and actually inspired me to get interested in the world and ultimately in human rights. We were talking just before this started about morning assemblies, which Ed would do every day of the week, and then he would do a sermon on Sundays where I sang in the choir. And I think it over time had an impact on me about the world and trying to do something to make a difference. And also he talked about his stories of Zimbabwe, where he used to be a headmaster. And one lesson I said to him, well, you keep talking about the Zimbabwe place, why don't you take us there on a school? And he did. He took us there 30 years ago, and from someone I grew up on a cheese farm in the other side of Taunton, to see the world through in a very, very different way, had a profound impact on me and wanting to do something that engaged with the world. So through the work that Ed had done at school, it gave me a sort of direction. So I thought I'd get involved with Oxfam when I went to university. Obviously not in the first year, because that was all about free subsidised drinking and nothing around. But in the second year, I thought I ought to do something useful. So I thought I'd go along and join the Oxfam group. There must be one there. There wasn't one. The person that ran the Amnesty group was retiring and going on to other things and needed someone to do it. And I got involved with Amnesty then and have been involved ever since. I did, as Ed said, psychology as an undergraduate, and wrote about influencing student attitudes to the death penalty as my project. Whether you could change the order of questions that you ask people about the death penalty in a questionnaire to ultimately affect their viewpoint on it at the end. So if you start by asking them about all the nitty-gritty and the things that go wrong with the death penalty and all that kind of stuff, would that ultimately make them less certain about their view on it? And we did that.
What conclusions?
I needed a bigger sample size to have any statistically significant results. So yes, but there was definitely something there. I think the idea was, people may say they've got a strong view on the death penalty, but actually if you drill down, most people will recognise that there are really significant problems with it as a practical thing, whatever your moral perspective on it. So having done that, and decided I didn't want to be a psychologist after all, I thought, well, I want to do human rights, but I didn't know exactly how to. I didn't know what that means, what I'm going to actually do with my life to be useful. So then I went and found this course that was called Human Rights, and I thought, well, that sounds up my street. I'll do that in Leicester for a year, having done a bit of travelling, more travelling. And it was great. I worked. My tutor was recently in the news representing Israel in the International Criminal Court. That barrister there, who's in his late 70s now, early 80s, even older than you, I think. He was the tutor who ran the law department at the time. I remember then having conversations about international law and about proportionality and just war theory, all that kind of stuff, in a theoretical sense, not knowing that he'd be there trying to defend what many of us might think was indefensible now. So it's interesting how the world is actually quite small. But anyway, we got into Amnesty International there. I set up another group there. And I actually wrote my master's thesis on Amnesty at 40, as it then was, and how it was developing around economic, social and cultural rights, as well as its traditional base in civil and political rights, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, and what it actually meant. And again, the outcome was, well, that's just where it is at the time. So I didn't go any further with that at that point. But I ended up getting a job working with actions against the police and the prison service for deaths in custody, for victims of police shootings and that kind of thing. Working in a firm in London under a chap called Daniel Mackover, who is a brilliant lawyer and he's still fighting the fight. And trying to support families in inquests and things like that. And I had some great years there as a paralegal, which is an unqualified lawyer, basically a dog's body that does lots of hard work, but the solicitor takes the credit for it. So then I'd met my wife at university doing the masters and thought, well, she lived in Barcelona, and I thought, well, Barcelona's got to be better than London, so we better live out there for a bit. We met Ed and Audrey actually out in Barcelona at some point as well. I think you were half thinking about going out there yourself, weren't you?
Yeah.
So we went out there, and I qualified from there into law, so I fully qualified as a solicitor, distance learning, and came back, did my training and all of that, and then worked in various different roles as a solicitor in legal aid. And legal aid has been pretty much butchered since I started doing it. It was very badly paid then, but it was extraordinarily badly paid now, which is fair enough because you don't go into it for the money, but if you can't actually run a firm doing legal aid, then it will die, and it has done. And I've seen people commit suicide, who were colleagues. I've seen people who've just been run into the ground, just trying to take on enough work to make it viable to do without not being able to offer anything proper to your clients, and it's been a battle. So I did that in Bristol for 10 years, let's say. Mostly actually in housing in the end. I started off in community care, sort of challenging a lack of care resources given by local authorities, which was a really frustrating process where you feel it's not down to the individual social worker, it's often not down to the manager that this isn't being done properly, it's just down to bad resourcing and not being able to keep the care component consistent to actually provide the care that's needed. So that was really quite a distressing role, but insightful, and you meet wonderful people and you do what you can to use the law that's there to help them to get the best that they can. And then in housing, trying to keep people from being evicted, often because they had mental health problems that led them to get into antisocial behaviour issues with their landlord or their neighbours, and then trying to fight for them to keep a home over their roof over their heads. So I did that and quite enjoyed it, and enjoyed Bristol working life, living with my family in Taunton and going up on the train, which could be frustrating at times. But that worked pretty well. We all moaned about how badly funded we were and how the system could be better. But ultimately, my boss, who was just turned 60, couldn't afford to keep it going, and had invested everything in it. Her and some of her friends and colleagues had put this firm together just to do legal aid work. We weren't a specialist firm with a big private practice that subsidised it. These were all people dedicated to doing working for justice for people, individuals. So there was an immigration team, there was a welfare benefits team, and there was a housing team. And immigration, they took that out of legal aid largely, so some asylum was left. But they were then really struggling. They completely removed welfare benefits. So one of the original founders of the group, who was a director in, was a judge in legal aid and worked in tribunals, bringing these cases, he could no longer work as a solicitor because there was no funding. So he had to then work for free at Bristol University doing a pro bono legal centre to offer some advice at least to people. So yeah, they struggled on as long as they could. Immense financial cost to themselves, like they never really made money out of it until ultimately after COVID and the furlough, the firm couldn't function anymore. And having been made redundant in London when they brought in the first tranche of cuts, and then being made redundant again when the firm closed down, and having the option of perhaps going on where most of the work went to the law centre in Bristol, I didn't really have the stomach for it, and work in that environment had become very stressful, particularly working from home, bringing home a lot of work, not the actual clients themselves, but the client work, and I just felt I wasn't necessarily physically and emotionally up to it anymore. So I'd take on a different challenge and teach instead. And I didn't know what exactly I would teach. My main interest was in human rights, and so I did that. I actually trained as an RE teacher, which is an interesting experience. There are only 3 of us down in Exeter, St Luke's, but it was great. It was great fun. It was a really interesting year. Quite hard work for someone as lazy as me. And then I very fortunately managed to get a job teaching A-level law down in a place in Crediton called Queen Elizabeth School. It's about 500 years old, comprehensive school with a sixth form of its own, where they teach law with a human rights component, or they were. The law syllabus that we do has 2 options, either contract law or human rights law. And unfortunately, a lot of teachers in like the local college, Richard Hewish, very good college, teaching law in Taunton where I live, about a 5-minute walk from my house, they do the contract bit because they think contract law is more interesting, more useful to students to know about contract and business and all of that than human rights would be to them. Well, I don't agree with that. I think actually, especially in this day and age, human rights is extremely interesting but also extremely useful to know what's happening with your rights. So I was very fortunate that they needed someone. The person that was there was retiring, and I took that on as a job last September. My first group of A-level people have finished last week, so the lack of preparation is due to me doing very worthy things with that. But it's been an eye-opener to see what schools can do with human rights. Some notes here. Oh yes, I was going to tell you about primary schools and dinghies. I'm just going to go through all the schools up until 6th form. So, moving away from my job at the moment doing human rights, my youngest daughter is in primary school at the moment in Somerset. They've started, or they've now got a gold award in something called the UNICEF Rights Respecting Schools program. I don't know if any of you have come across that. But UNICEF do this brilliant scheme where they support schools to bring human rights into their everyday schooling, so that the students learn about it, the staff learn about it, the parents learn about it. It becomes integrated into the into the newsletters that they send home, into the displays that they do at school. The theme work that they do on topics has an element of human rights brought into it. So it's not an add-on, it's something that influences and becomes part of the school's whole value system. Brilliant scheme where you go up to a gold award, which they've just got this year actually. And the person that did it is actually retiring this year, but she's been absolutely fantastic in driving home and getting this whole ethos around human rights embedded as best they can in a primary school. And I went in for one of the talks that we did on human rights, and I brought in a dinghy, an inflatable dinghy, and had the kids wearing life jackets, and we talked about, and it was a toy dinghy that I used with the kids, and we talked about how that's what a dinghy should be for. It should be for playing in, it should not be for bringing people across the channel, and we talked about the policy of the government of the day in terms of trying to stop this from happening, and in an appropriate way to 5 to 9-year-olds what the issues were and how they would feel about that. So that's primary school human rights education in practice, and it's a brilliant scheme. Then secondary school, when I was training, as I said, I had to train in religious education because it was the only subject they would let me do because of my A levels. There wasn't a drama one or a theatre studies one, so religious education it was, and that had a component in it around rights. And I worked at a school in Shire called Holyrood with a woman called Michelle Sullivan. Now I don't know if any of you have come across. She's involved with church things around the place. Quite an interesting lady, very high standards. And she had this idea that she thought that there weren't enough women in human rights known to the students. And she said, look, I know you're interested in human rights. Do something about this. I want a component of work, I want you to build something that we can do with the students going up through different age groups in secondary school that recognises the contribution of women to human rights. She said, I've got a book, I think it's very good, about Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the people that she worked with, other women that she worked with. Take that away, come up with a scheme of work. On top of doing the whole PGCE thing. So that's what we did, and we came up with something, where is it? Which basically took the kids through various different people who influenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including some really fascinating women whose names were almost universally unknown. And I haven't got to see the fruits of it because then you move on and do something else. But hopefully, somewhere in Shire at the moment, people are learning about the contribution of women to the Universal Declaration. If anybody wants to have a look at that, I will make it available to you. Carrying this around, because I got this in Zimbabwe when Ed took us there in 1994, and it sat in a drawer for years, and I thought that would be a good prop to bring along. So that was secondary, young secondary human rights education in action. And then there's my bit, what I'm doing now, which is just sixth form, so I don't have to deal with the youngsters, just deal with sixth formers. And I've been doing law, as I explained, but also a little bit of sociology. And sociology includes, my bit was on crime and deviance. And within crime and deviance, there's a bit about global human rights. So we got to talk about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang and the genocide there, and no one had heard about it. There's been so little about it in the news that the students had absolutely no idea what that was. And I've been going to Amnesty meetings for 25, 30 years. We've never stopped talking about the persecution of the Uyghurs. It's been a constant thread running through, and this horrific thing that was going on is just unknown. So with a very small element of what we could do in sociology, we were trying to educate about global human rights abuses like that, so that state crime, defining what state crime is so that they can better understand crime within a sociological context. I don't know how well we got that message across. The trouble with a lot of the A-levels is they try and cram in a vast amount of content, which you've got to memorise because there's no component of coursework. So you've got to memorise essays that you then splurt out on a different topic. so not in the depth that you would want on any of those things, but I did my best to try and get some of that across in sociology. And then another element of A-level is that you get to do this thing called personal development with the whole lot of them. So we don't have assemblies every day like we used to back in the day, but you do get the occasional one. And I said, well, I would like to do something on the rule of law. I said, fine, that's part of the personal development, that we've got to teach British values to the students. That's one of our requirements. We're supposed to teach citizenship as well. The government's take on what citizenship and British values is, we've got to do that. And it's quite a strange thing, really, because the government, for all of their faults, thinks that students, young people, should learn about British values, they should learn about the rule of law, and they set out, kind of, what they think the rule of law is. And if you go onto the government pages and look up the rule of law, you'll find a lovely article about Tom Bingham and his views on what the rule of law should be, and it's very expansive. It includes respect for human rights and respect for international law. So the government is telling us to teach them, the students, about the importance of human rights and the rule of law and international agreements and all of that, whilst simultaneously they're doing playing out literally before our eyes. They're doing the Rwanda safety bill and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's brilliant for students, because you can say this stuff that's going on in the news that they don't watch because they're just on TikTok. But there's this thing called the BBC or Radio 4, or you can actually find this stuff. So I'm explaining that to them and saying, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about what the rule of law means and why it's been broken with the Rwanda safety bill. And they students aren't apathetic, and students aren't, oh, we don't care, we just want to do something else. Students are really interested in this stuff, but they don't necessarily get exposed to it at a level that they can engage with. And when they do, often it's in a kind of hyped way. So, although one of the great strengths of Amnesty is about individuals and about an emotional connection with an individual, be it a prisoner of conscience or a group of people that are being persecuted where you can feel an emotional attachment. One of the benefits of law or legal education, one of the benefits of education more generally, is that you should be able to approach these things in a slightly dispassionate way. And that can be helpful for young people to be able to take on the issues rather than just, well, this is terrible, who do we fight? That doesn't mean I'm not feeling passionately about it or feeling that the Rwanda legislation is just the worst of our humanity being played out in a slow and predictably awful way. So we got to talk about that in some depth. The idea that not just is it morally wrong to send people who are seeking asylum here to an African dictatorship, but that legally, if a court has looked at the evidence as to whether somewhere is safe and determined that it's not, the rule of law says they're an independent body. That's their call. It's not the government's call to say, well, we think it is safe. That's not how the system should work. If the system starts to work like that, the rule of law breaks down. And the students get that. So when the Supreme Court did their ruling on whether Rwanda was safe or not, it happened to coincide with my A-level group's lesson. So we got to watch it live as they read out in detail why this thing shouldn't happen. Dispassionately, we'd look at the evidence says it's not safe. And that was a great moment for me, because I thought, I'm teaching them something that's topical, it's relevant to their course because they need to know about this, and it's relevant to my interest in human rights. And that was a high point. Obviously then, I had to explain, well, yeah, but the government are probably now going to bring in a law that says it is safe. And they did. This will be an emergency bill, so I expect this will be done by Christmas, because it wasn't. It took 5 months for them to actually get it through. And they blamed everybody else for it going on. But students get that, and not just the law students, the rest of the students get to be exposed to some of that. Some of the other stuff they get to be exposed to, so we talked about the Chagos Islands, which links to Rwanda in a rather bizarre way. I don't know if you guys are human rights experts with some of you like 90 years worth of experience. So the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia had a load of refugees that we did send to Rwanda. So, and the reason that we could squeeze this into the law lessons is because the Privy Council were the ones that decided that we should break off Diego Garcia from Mauritius before we made it independent, so that we could give it to the Americans instead. And we rounded up all their dogs and gassed them in a I know it's not human rights, but it still makes the students listen. We gassed all their dogs. It just makes me really... And left all of these people without a home. And then we sent some of them to Rwanda, where they've not been getting on very well, surprisingly enough. So we squeeze in as much as we can of that kind of stuff as well, so they get to see about that. We also talk about abuse of power. So there's a great book called Emergency State about what happened during the pandemic to our liberties and freedoms, and how it wasn't a law that told us that we couldn't go out and go to another person's house and have relations with them and all of that. It was Matt Hancock who, by ministerial decree, said this is the rule from now on. And so we talk about how laws become laws, when ministers have the power to make laws, should ministers ever have the power to make laws, what controls there are over those. And that was pretty topical as well. So I got these guys to, beginning of the year, to write essays on, pick books from my collection of books about human rights stuff, and try and just understand that outside of their general curriculum. It was a complete disaster, a lot of them did. We won't be doing that next year, we'll be sticking to the exams. But that's my goal, is that they understand what's going on in the contemporary world about their rights, how that can feed into an understanding of the law and the legal system. Hopefully some of them will go on to become marvelous lawyers. So that's that lot. We also talk about things like the trial of Lady Chatterley, just because it's titillating stuff, and it was a sort of marked a change in the way that the government tried to control what was acceptable as freedom of expression and all of that. So the human rights component of the A-level law is one of 3 papers. So it's a big chunk, and we learn about a set of human rights from the European Convention, and how they balance off against each other, and how English law complements them or doesn't, and how that works. And they go through hundreds of cases, and we squeeze it all into a very limited amount of educational teaching time, and then they have to write about it in a 2-hour exam. So that, in a nutshell, is my experience in the last couple of years of human rights education. But I would like, if we can, to talk about human rights and human rights education more broadly, and get your thoughts on what I can do differently and whatever you've got questions on. So I didn't really have a conclusion to this, except to say thank you for inviting me. And would you guys like to ask me questions?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I live in the village of Pilton, which has Glastonbury Festival, so I have to leave. But on July 14th, my garden is being opened for Gaza. So my garden is Garden for Gaza, Open Garden for Gaza, July 14th, if you'd like to come. It's in Pilton, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of publicity. I have a very beautiful garden with a stream in the middle room. So,
and she has a beautiful garden.
I've been there before. Thank you, I'm sorry I have to go.
Glastonbury Festival was one of the places where I really got into Amnesty, because the Amnesty student group were able to get involved at Glastonbury. So in 1998, when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, we had this big truck that opened out and played Bob Marley's Get Up, Stand Up on a loop for 4 days. It was a really muddy year as well, so there weren't many places you could go that were dry, and this was one of them. And the sort of people that we got were under the influence of substance. But they really took an interest in our human rights displays about the Universal Declaration. And that was, Glastonbury and human rights was, I mean, at that time, I think it was Oxfam and Amnesty working together, and they did another combined campaign on higher standards for arms controls a couple of years later. And some festival goers stole our target. We had a big wooden target, which was great for burning, and they tried to get it every night, and eventually they got it and burned it on one of the hills. But yeah, Glastonbury was a great human rights education experience. They should try and do it again.
Yeah, evidently our group used to have a stall,
Yeah.
an amnesty stall in Glastonbury, but the costs, the fees for having
£2,000.
are far too great
Yeah.
now. So we can't do it, we can't do it. I was going to ask you, I mean, when we've done just a little bit of human rights education, we've often just introduced the kids to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah.
And get them to pick out various rights and to see, you know, and unpack the ones that they might be interested in or the ones that they surprise. Do you actually do anything as basic as that? I mean, this is much more interesting, this approach of the topics, etc. But do they get anything on the basic?
They do. I mean, when I was observing some younger ones being taught, back before I was a trainee in Taunton, they did exactly that. So they had, these are the 30 articles of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Sort of memorise some of these articles and then watch this video about one of these articles. So they were watching Hotel Rwanda, I think it was, and they were understanding how that linked to rights and equality and things like that. But it was done in quite a piecemeal way.
Yes.
The A-level syllabus for law, for this component, the human rights component, starts with the Second World War and the Universal Declaration. So the opening bit of it that I do with them is something that I saw as a trainee actually, which is this guy, Leon Greenman's truck that he made for his son. And they were British Jews living in the Netherlands at the outbreak of just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And they didn't have their ID documents and they got rounded up and his son and his wife were murdered on the first day that they got to concentration camp. And he was one of these leading light campaigners to raise awareness. And I think it was the Holocaust Museum provided materials for the school to how do you get across to children these kind of stories? And they did it through this image and trying to get the students to work out what the image is and whether it was handmade and was the person wealthy that made it and drawing those connections out before they go on to what it ultimately led to. Things like the details that he gave when they were all on the train together, he was speaking to his wife about how they would hopefully be able to support their son if something terrible happened to one of them, not appreciating that the target instantly would be the son at the other end, that it would be the children that would be killed first, not them. And so you get that kind of thing across as best you can when you're doing an academic subject, and as I said, I think there are benefits to it being an academic subject, but you do have to get across the gravity of why we have human rights at all and why, I know there were human rights pre-Second World War, but we do try and draw out where this came from. And people like Michelle Sullivan, who runs her RE department, are very much trying to say, well, what's the essence of it? You know, how does this link to human dignity? How does this reflect the world that we live in beyond just an academic process that has a tick box exercise at the end?
Very good. Can we have more questions, please? Yes.
Let me ask you, you're talking about even having input at primary level.
Yeah.
Is there a national element in the syllabus of human rights teaching along with the personal development? And is Amnesty trying to push for that as part of the school syllabus? Because it seems it is the subject that every child should be learning from age 5 up to post-university.
Not that I'm aware of. That's not to say that it doesn't happen and that many schools might do it in a more piecemeal way. But the only thing I'm aware of at a secondary school level is this personal development program that you have to teach in some form. The trouble with it is that it's not a subject that you get a GCSE in. So it's taught by whoever's free, and it's taught whenever they're free, and it literally is a tick box exercise. So you have to teach citizenship, but how you teach citizenship is entirely dependent on who you've got available and whether. And some brilliant work is done, and people put some really great materials together, but it's not done in a joined up way. And Amnesty really I think it's one of the areas that Amnesty ought to be working on. Amnesty's membership, I think, in the last sort of 15, 20 years has dropped dramatically, and most membership organisations their memberships have dropped. One that hasn't is the National Union of Students. Its membership is now over 6 million students. So there is a vast resource of people that at a time of their life when this would be interesting to them. And I think Amnesty should absolutely be focusing on school and university educational opportunities and extracurricular opportunities to just embed some consideration of human rights at that level. I know we're competing with everything else that, in a way that we weren't when I joined Amnesty, but even so, I think there's definitely scope for that to make it something that more people are more informed on. Because, you know, if we get a right-wing government, not the next one, but the one after that, the European Convention on Human Rights could be binned without any discussion of depth or what it's about or why we had it in the first place or what it's done for individual people, because the vast majority of young people and older people won't have heard those arguments. So, I mean, the reason that UKIP wanted to bin it initially was because of prisoner voting, because a guy called Hurst wanted to be able to vote after he murdered his landlady. And he was never going to get the right to vote, and the court never said he needed the right to vote. The court just said you couldn't have a blanket policy that had never looked at whether anybody who's a prisoner can vote. And the way to resolve it turned out to be that you could just have a policy where people who are on remand can have a right to vote if they are on remand at that point. And I don't even know that they ever implemented that policy, but it was something eminently fixable. It was something that didn't gravely harm any of our rights, and yet it was the poster boy for why we needed to get rid of human rights in this country. And this false idea that you can have a British Bill of Rights that will come up again instead, and we'll somehow do it the British way, and that the British Bill of Rights will be the perfect outcome because it will protect our British rights, the nice white people's British rights, but it will definitely not protect the prisoners' rights or the refugees' rights. That's the new kind of human rights that will come from a British Bill of Rights. And if students don't learn at school why that's just a nonsense, then I fear that that's the route we will go down.
Is that something that Amnesty might work towards? Because I'm part of Humanist UK.
Yeah.
And in their lobbying, they've managed to get humanism included in the syllabus for RE teaching in Wales so far. But the idea is to try and keep pushing that so that you've got that going in at the ground level.
Yeah.
That it's just everyday education. It's not something you then do out with normal life.
Thank you. There is another question. Yes.
I'll talk to you about, I'm very interested in the humanist development of RE syllabuses, because I joined it as well to see what we could do for that purpose. But yeah, we can talk about that.
The lady in the blue, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wasn't around when the human rights thing was at least very, very tiny, but I did do my education training 60 years ago. And I think there is a huge difference between then and now. It's affecting society and indeed our understanding of human rights. Because then it was very much education. Yes, there was what we taught in the curriculum, but we didn't have a curriculum that every school has to have or anything like that. We had to, yes, you had to teach children to read, to write, but I think there was also a great concentration that education was helping to develop the child as fully as possible, but also the group as fully as possible. And that, I've noticed we haven't had the word responsibility yet, but this is something which was very much part of their education, that children had to take responsibility for themselves and their neighbours. And I think that we've got into a society now where it is all, somebody says, makes a law, makes a plan, this and that, rather than concentrating on the quality of life that we have, the communities that we build. And I think unless we have that, that for me is real education, and it comes at all ages, including mine, it's great, but it's not going to have the effect that we want. And I have seen this from both sides, both from...
Is your question about whether human rights education, should it include more about responsibilities for
I think
others?
it certainly should include, because every right has a responsibility. Now that was drummed into us.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it is today, but what
So
I'm
we
saying
can
is that
ask
it's
them
not just the, it's, we can learn the facts, but what is being done to help them to put it into their lives, to live it?
Right, so let's Ben answer some of that.
It is. If you're looking at an A-level law, you will look at which rights are absolute and which ones are not, and which ones have what kind of corresponding duty attached to them. So, for example, the right not to be tortured.
Right.
There's no corresponding. You don't earn the right not to be tortured. And the students, I think one of the risks. I agree with you that. But I think largely students do within their own communities. They do support each other. So, but I fear that the system is working against them for a start. So the system, as I see it, is pressuring their time. They've got staff that are massively overworked. They've got curriculum that aren't realistic in terms of what they can physically take in and process, and they don't necessarily have the thinking time that you might have had in an earlier education system where you could have a topic and actually discuss, and certainly at A-level, you haven't got time for a day or two's discussion about the origins of these kinds of rights and responsibilities. But I think one of the problems with focusing too much on the sort of the counter to the right and the responsibility is that you would then say, well, these people should lose some rights. So that if you say that you've got a right to family life, but you don't have a right to asylum as such, you don't have a right to be reunited with your family, that's, it's your responsibility to deal with that in a different way. I think that can be an issue, that you end up accidentally caveating rights which are universal. The right not to be tortured is just an absolute right. It's probably the only right that, however you put it, there's no caveat to it. Even the right to life, which we're taught in the textbook to say is an absolute right, and then we're taught to explain all the reasons why it's not an absolute right. Because you can take life to protect another life. You can take life if you're a policeman in this particular situation, that can happen. So you have to caveat those, whereas you don't with torture. And so there's no, and I think one of the problems with rights generally is that it's difficult to get complex ideas across in a tight, like rights to do with prisoners, or rights to do with any unpopular group. It's really hard to just say, well, no, they've got a right to them. That the traveller community in your local area have got a right to be treated with respect and a right to have somewhere that they can. Well, why have they got a right? I haven't got a right. To, explaining that in enough depth is quite difficult, and you will find an unpopular group in whatever community and however enlightened they are. You will find a group that they're not all that keen on, and that will be the group that lose their rights.
Okay, we got in. You can have a chat afterwards on these issues. Yes.
But I want to say that one of the things that we've allowed to slip, because most of us concern us until we get into the trap, is the loss of legal aid.
Yeah.
That I was astonished to find that the Baggy King, which the third introduced legal aid, for the poorest of my subjects should always have recourse to the law. And that was told till 2012, when it stopped.
Well, last page
And now
yeah.
you can't. It's not universal anymore. Once upon a time, it's to do with money all the time, isn't it? Funding. You lose the funding.
Yeah.
You lose your ability to teach rights because it's not being funded.
Yeah, it's all about money. The legal aid cuts is why I became made redundant, because they changed the category. So in 2012, they reduced the number of categories that you could get legal aid for, but they've never put the rates up in civil legal aid, which is what I did, from 1996 onwards. So the rates never changed. So whereas a similarly qualified solicitor of my years of seniority could be getting £600 or £700 an hour in a private setting. In a legal aid setting, I was getting £159 per case. And I might spend many hours doing that. And if they didn't bring in the right proof of benefit, I wouldn't get anything for it. And I would spend as much time finding the right proof of benefits. Are you on universal credit? No, I'm on this more complicated benefit. Well, then I need to see all the paperwork. Well, I don't have all the paperwork. Well, then I can't assist you. Except that I'm spending an hour with them anyway going through this stuff, so then you do have to do some form of assistance. That's what's broken. And yeah, the rates didn't change. The number of things you could get legal aid for diminished. And you're right, that when legal aid came out, sort of 80 odd years ago, 80-ish years ago, when legal aid was introduced in its current form, I think 70% or more of people would qualify for it. Now, I used to turn away people on benefits because they were on the wrong kinds of benefits and they had too much money on benefits to get legal aid. So now it's only if you're on the right sort of benefits and you've got absolutely nothing that you get legal aid. And even then, you need to find someone that's got it. That has crippled.
It's such a sort of hidden thing, because until you're in a situation, you
Yeah.
don't even know what it's all about, and you've actually got to be in a situation needing the law,
Yeah,
which for most people, probably their whole lifetime will go past without it.
No,
without it, you know.
that's right. And then when you do, you find out actually the system's broken. You know, you have to wait months to get into court over whatever the
Do
issue
you have
is.
any way of getting it back?
I can't see it. I mean, I think you can certainly make it less bad, but once you've lost all the expertise, it's very hard to build it up again. Like, a generation of people have not gone into legal aid because it's just not something that you can do. There are people that still want to do that kind of work. There's record numbers of people going into law, but without being too cynical, most of them are looking at the jobs with starter salaries of £100,000 as a trainee, not a job where, I mean, I took a pay rise to become a brand newly qualified teacher, part-time, from my part-time job as a senior 10 years plus qualified solicitor. I took a big pay rise in my rate because they're so undervalued. But then money for lawyers isn't a great campaign slogan.